Okay, so we're going to look at what it was like governing the colonies after the French and Indian War and then after Pontiac's Rebellion. And so we're going to focus on this video with 1763 to 1764 and all the trouble that the British have in governing the colonies. That trouble really starts right away with the Proclamation of 1763, which is right there at the end of the French and Indian War. And this proclamation is really just basically a line all along the boundary of the colonies, and it's obviously not as straight a line as that. It follows the mountains there, the Appalachian Mountains, and it says colonists don't move out that way. It tells them those that have moved out past that line, basically you need to move back, and it doesn't mean you can't cross the line ever. You can cross the line for trade, but not for settlement. The problem, though, is the colonists don't like that. They want to continue to move out there. There's a desire for land. There's some excellent land there on the Ohio River Valley, and it's a highly sought after territory. Not only that, payment. Many American colonists actually that fought in the French and Indian War didn't. Part of their compensation for that fighting was actually huge land grants out in that territory, and now they're being told not to go there. So it's a bit of a problem in their minds. But the biggest problem for the British is, how are we going to enforce this? You're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles of frontier land. And how are you going to stop people from moving out there? You're talking about vast wilderness. How are you going to stop people? How are you going to know when they've gone there? And then what are you going to do? And the purpose of this was to prevent war with the Native Americans that were in that territory. The treaties that had been signed actually already, part of those treaties indicated, hey, we're not going to let colonists continue to move out there. And so this is an expectation that the Indians have, this is an expectation that the British have, and this is exactly the opposite of the expectation that the colonists have. The colonists expect to continue to move out there, and it's really difficult to stop. And so this creates a problem and a lot of resistance but time after time over the coming years, this territory is, new treaties are settled and new territory is opened up. So as that new territory opens up over the coming years, this becomes less and less of an issue. What is going to be a big problem for the colonists is the Sugar Act of 1764. And this law has actually already been on the books for decades by now. But what the British do is they actually lower the tax, thinking that that'll make this tax more palatable. Like I said, it's been on the books for a long time, but they've been smuggling, bringing in sugar from the Dutch West Indies and other places in the West Indies that are not British. And they're supposed to only bring in British sugar, basically, and there's not a tax on that. And any sugar from somebody else is taxed. Well, the British sugar is much more expensive in many cases than some of these other colonies, and so it was very common to just smuggle it in, and there was really limited enforcement. It's difficult to enforce. It takes pretty significant bureaucracy and manpower to enforce taxes at this time period, and so this increases lowers the tax in a common tactic by the British, lowering a tax to make it more palatable, but then also increasing enforcement. Well, this coincides with an economic depression in the colonies, which is a result of the end of the French and Indian War, and it's a nice scapegoat. They end up blaming the Sugar Act on this economic depression, when the reality is that the depression is a result of the loss of money, the British spending money to outfit the soldiers after the French and Indian War. And so these things, in combination with just the fact that the colonists really don't like these taxes, they don't really feel like the British Parliament has the right to tax them. And you've heard the phrase, no taxation without representation, and that is a complaint that they have. And it's fairly mild, the complaints about this at this point. It's mostly in New England and New York, where a lot of the sugar is being brought into, and so it's not a widespread they're not throughout the colonies, not in the southern colonies and most of the middle colonies. They're not necessarily really upset about this because it doesn't directly impact them as much. If we're really going to start to understand, excuse me, start to understand the colonists' complaints about taxation and this idea of no taxation without representation versus taxation with representation, we're going to have to talk about several things here to best understand the coming taxes and other laws that the British are going to try to pass. And so the first one is the big one that people kind of know about, no taxation without representation. And the issue here is what's going to stop a parliament or a legislative branch, a group of people, the government, from taxing you more. In this system that they have set up, you can tax somebody, but the reason you have the authority to tax them is because they have the ability to vote you out of office. And so if taxes become too high and too burdensome, well, people are voted out of office, and they learn their lesson, and they vote people in that will lower taxes. And so that's a kind of a check on the power of taxation, that you can't tax people that you are not being represented. That's the idea behind that. And so they want only to be taxed by people that are by governing bodies that they are represented in, and they do not have representation in Parliament. Now, one common thing that people will often say is they really wanted representation in Parliament. Well, that's not true. It's not that they wanted representation in Parliament. That was not going to be the solution in their mind. They just simply wanted their colonial assemblies to be the ones that had the right to tax them. And so that's the issue of taxation without representation. If the colonial assemblies tax them, they agree with those. They have representation. It's fair. That's the way they want it. The other issue is whether it's an internal tax or an external tax. And we need to think of internal taxes as goods that are taxed that are the goods that are being taxed are produced within the colony, within that country, and that's an internal tax. And in the future, we'll see the Stamp Act as an example of that. External taxes are goods that are taxed upon importation into the colony. So the Sugar Act is an example of that. Taxes that were brought into the colony from the Dutch West Indies and these other areas, these other countries, there was a tax on that. And the issue here is regulating trade. They kind of accepted external taxes more if the idea is that they're regulating trade. If the purpose of the tax is to kind of control how much commerce is being done with these other countries like the Dutch and the French or the Spanish, if they're trying to control the amount of trade that's going on between these countries, it's called regulating trade. That idea is accepted. They've accepted that for a long time. If the purpose of the tax, whether it's an internal tax or an external tax, is simply to raise revenue, and it's not really about controlling trade, then that was something they didn't like. And so raising revenue means raising money. So if the purpose of the tax is simply to raise money, that's not good. If the purpose of the tax is to regulate trade, that's accepted. They see that Parliament has the right to regulate trade within the British Empire. They don't necessarily agree Parliament has the right to raise money from the colonies without representation. And so that's the big issue. Internal taxation is certainly the most hated taxes. That would be an example of that is the Stamp Act, and we'll be talking more about that in the next video. But it's really important to understand no taxation without representation. That's a problem. And then if it's an external tax, is the purpose of it to regulate trade? It's okay. If the purpose is to raise revenue or to raise money, simply to raise money, then that's not accepted. And so that's kind of the issues that are going on with these taxes that we talked about with the Sugar Act and that we'll be continuing to talk about with some of these others that we see on this chart. So look forward to the next video. Thanks.